Welcome. This devotional is brought to you by the You Need Faith in Jesus team. Today, we're diving into a really raw and honest story from Scripture, one that's packed with timeless truths about failure, fear, and God's incredible faithfulness. So let's just ask the tough question right up front. What happens when a person of faith, a man of God, completely messes up? It's a question the Bible isn't afraid to answer. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 20 today, looking at a story that reveals a powerful, unshakable truth. God is faithful even when his people are not. All right, so our story starts with Abraham, the great patriarch of faith. He's just arrived in a new land called Gerar. But as he steps into this new territory, a very old, very familiar fear starts to creep back in. Now, if you're thinking, wait a second, this sounds really familiar. Well, you're right. This is basically a repeat offense for Abraham. Just like he did way back in Genesis 12 in Egypt, he falls back on this deceptive half-truth, calling his wife his sister, all because he's afraid for his own neck. You know, this proverb just perfectly nails the situation. Abraham's fear of what man might do to him became a trap, a snare that put absolutely everything at risk. And we're not just talking about Sarah's safety here. God's entire covenant promise, the Messianic line that was supposed to come through her, was hanging in the balance. And here we have Abraham's big confession when he finally gets confronted. It all comes down to those first three words, because I thought. He made this huge, life-altering decision based on an assumption, on what he thought other people might do, instead of standing on the promises of a God who had already proven himself faithful over and over again. And the irony here is just incredible. The pagan king he was so afraid of, Abimelech, ends up showing a much more profound, much more real fear of God than the patriarch of faith himself does in this moment. Think about that. Abraham feared man. Abimelech feared God. So just when it looks like human failure has painted God's plan into a corner, God himself steps right into the middle of this man-made crisis. Just notice the authority and the clarity here. God doesn't mess around. He demonstrates his absolute sovereignty by speaking directly to a pagan king to protect his covenant and, this is so important, to uphold the sanctity of marriage. God is not a passive observer in our lives. And this verse, right here, is such a brilliant illustration of a profound theological idea, God's preventative grace. God actually acknowledges Abimelech's innocent intentions, but he makes it crystal clear who is really in control of the situation. So, the bottom line is, it was God's power, his direct intervention, that stopped Abimelech. God makes it personal. He says, I also withheld thee from sinning against me. This wasn't about Abimelech's personal goodness. It was all about God's restraining hand, protecting his ultimate purpose from getting derailed by human error. Okay, so the story takes another fascinating turn. The man of faith now gets confronted face to face by the very man he deceived. Talk about a humbling moment. Just listen to that rebuke. Abimelech, the unbeliever, is the one who rightly calls Abraham's action a great sin that could have brought disaster on his whole kingdom. It's a really sobering scene where the world has to teach the believer about righteousness. Ouch. But then we get to the amazing part. Even in the middle of this humiliating failure, God himself affirms Abraham's identity and his calling. This is God speaking to Abimelech, telling him that the guy who just lied to his face is still his prophet. And this is a really big deal. This is actually the very first time the word Nabi, or prophet, is used in the Bible. So the takeaway here is absolutely crucial. God's calling is irrevocable. Abraham's failure, his sin, did not disqualify him from his God-given purpose as an intercessor. And this powerful truth leads us straight into the conclusion of the story, which is just this beautiful moment of restoration and miraculous healing. And just like that, the prophetic office is restored to its function. The man who failed now prays, and God answers with power. He opens the wombs that he had previously closed in judgment. Abraham becomes a channel for the very blessing of fruitfulness that he himself is still waiting to receive. It's just incredible. When you step back and look, this one chapter is just packed with foundational truths about God's character. It shows us his sovereignty, his commitment to marriage, the real power of prayer, his grace that covers our failures, and his active healing power in our world. Okay, So that's a great story from thousands of years ago. But what does this ancient story of failure and grace actually mean for us right here, right now? Because it's not just history. Let's break down some practical takeaways for our own lives. The ultimate takeaway is that God's faithfulness is always, always greater than our failure. This chapter really challenges us in three key ways. First, to examine our motives. Are we making choices out of fear, like Abraham did, or out of genuine faith in God's promises? Second, to trust his sovereignty, to remember that his purpose for our lives is secure, even when our circumstances feel threatening. And finally, to embrace intercession, to realize that our past mistakes and imperfections don't disqualify us from being a powerful voice in prayer for others. So the question this chapter leaves us with is this: will we let our failures define us, or will we let them become a testimony to the unfailing grace of a God who restores and uses us anyway?